once again, my name is Maurice Sparrow, and this channel is called The Child with Special Needs, and we'll be exploring all aspects of special needs, the vast world of special needs, including damage to the brain, the visual system, and so on, and strategies and what we can do to help them. But I thought I'd start off today by introducing a book or a manual that I wrote just a few years ago, and it's called What Can I Do for My CVI Child? I wrote this in 2011. That's about 12 years ago, a long time ago. Let me just explain the background to this and how it came about. One of the families that I visited at that time had a little boy. His name was Sam, and I introduced him in this book, and he had a condition called microcephaly, and he had cerebral visual impairment. He had trauma to the brain which caused him severe developmental delay, and as I helped the family, they took everything on board that I suggested, and he did make progress. Now, one day I suggested that we go to visit a doctor, a professor up in Glasgow in Scotland. His name was Professor Gordon Dutton, and I had been following his online training and going to some of his training events for a couple of years, and this is really where I got the passion and enthusiasm to learn and to help children with this difficulty. So we actually went there one day, and we spent a whole day in the hospital. It was absolutely fascinating, and rather than just a sort of short 10-minute interview with the child, Professor Dutton spent, I think, a couple of hours with him, and his whole team did tests on him, and it was a whole day of assessments. Absolutely fascinating. And when I got back home, I had to say that Glasgow was extremely cold, and when I got back home I actually had caught a chill, and I was quite ill, and this was like the first day of the holiday, the Christmas break. So I actually had flu, and I spent the whole of Christmas and New Year basically isolated, and it wasn't even coronavirus, but I kind of self-isolated anyway because I was feeling so ill. But I used the time profitably in my study, and I wrote basically summary of this book, the summary of the assessment. And what came out was 10 chapters. I call it What Can I Do for My CVI Child? One Problem with 10 Solutions. I mean, if I look back now, my knowledge at that time was limited, and I used to think of CVI as kind of one entity, but actually, like visual impairment, there are many different types. CVI, there are a vast array of difficulties, so we should really be talking about CVIs, not CVI, but nevertheless, I wrote this book, and it was really interesting to write it, and it was very much appreciated by the family, and I did training in the nursery, and I've given this away since then to anyone who is interested or will find it useful, and people still find it useful. But I want to just summarise the chapters in this book now, and maybe just go through one of them in particular. So as I go through this, the chapters deal with basically strategies of how we can help a child who has cerebral visual impairment, a child with difficulty in perceiving the world, difficulty in seeing what we see. And I start off by giving this point that the greatest difficulty your child has may be a physical motor difficulty, it may be all sorts of things, but from our point of view, from a learning point of view and a developmental point of view, the greatest difficulty the child has is giving attention. And this has come to the fore quite recently with a different word. We talk about engagement very much now. And if you can't engage a child with special needs, you're not going to be able to teach him. But I would use the word visual attention or just attention as a key word here. And this is kind of running right the way through this book. So if you start with a starting point that you are trying to get the child's attention, and anything competing with the attention that you're trying to get is going to be a challenge, then we are actually on the right roads. So the first thing I talk about in this book is presenting things one at a time, not all together. And I'll go into it in a bit more detail, but the basic strategy I'll just summarise to start off with today. It's presenting things singly, with the assumption that children, young children, and children with difficulties like this cannot dual process. They cannot handle more than one thing at once. And the second thing is, along with this, is present things one sense at a time as well. And for example, I mean, I've recently had a second grandchild, and it just reminds me that when you're working with or when you're playing with the child and you want their attention, you don't bombard them with 2 or 3 senses at once. You don't give them a sweet or give them food and talk and show them things all at the same time. Or if you do, it could create problems. It is better with a child with CVI to just use one sense at a time. So for example, if you're working on vision, don't talk. So you just present things and just show things, because talking is a distraction. And I notice this when I'm on the Underground in London. If I'm reading something or trying to read the newspaper, the Metro, and suddenly there's a noise over the tannoy where they give you a notice, immediately I stop reading. I cannot actually dual process. And if I can't dual process, then just imagine the difficulty that children like this have. So one at a time, one sensory input. And then the third strategy is slowly catch ye monkey. And that's an old phrase, but basically it means that everything has to be slowed down. When you're working with a child, you have to slow your work down with them. You have to talk slowly. You have to give time for them to respond. You have to do everything in slow motion, because that child with sensory difficulties or learning difficulties, cerebral visual impairment, that child responds slowly, and there's always a delay. There's always a lag in them responding. So if you're presenting something, don't just sort of show it and then take it away, but hold it there and give maybe the child half a minute to respond. Give them time to respond. Slow motion. The next one is crowding. The crowding effect is more perhaps in line with the difficulty they have seeing several things at once, but the world is crowded. And if you're working with an older child and maybe they're trying to read, the page is full of words, or maybe pictures on the page, and things may be closely crowded together. And so this chapter is really about trying to space things. And if you think about many primary school classrooms, they are packed with displays. The walls are very crowded. And I think it's important just to sort of bear this in mind when you're creating an environment, that you give spaces so that things are not too crowded together. I won't go over everything, but basically the rest of it deals with keeping things really simple, not complicating things. And then there's a major kind of chapter on creating a background. And one of the things that was in my mind was working with a teaching assistant once, and this boy with learning difficulties, I told her that she needs to create a background that's non-distracting. So she actually made A4 and A3 cards with a black felt background, and she put maybe one object on there for him to take, and another object may be spaced well apart, and it seemed to work. Because she'd created a background, he was able visually to see the one thing and then the other thing. And you'd actually worked on creating a background. And that idea of creating a background is absolutely key to all our work with children with cerebral vision impairment. Making the right kind of background, making the right environment. So it's basically the sum of the book. And I think that there's so many things that we could say. I don't want to overload you with information, but I would say that if you get a hold of a copy of this, you might find some of it quite useful. And that's really it for today. So thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow or another day. Okay, bye now.